Tonight I'm joined by Andy Meddick. How are you going, Andy?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
My absolute pleasure. You've made a comeback. I'm sure most of my listeners will have already heard your first edition, which I reckon I was trying to remember. It was definitely over a year ago, and I can definitely say, yeah, things have changed in that time. So I'm really excited to have you back. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, look, certainly. Look, they say a week is a long time in politics, and I think even a day is a long time in politics. But yeah, a lot's happened in that year. So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, as everyone probably knows, we're getting close now to the upcoming state election in Victoria, so we're getting towards the end of your term, your 4-year term in Parliament. I can't even imagine. How do you feel about that?
Oh, look, in some ways, very excited because I actually do like the election campaigns. I like being out on the hustings and speaking to people and being at the booths and handing out how to vote cards. And I like the public forums, the cut and thrust of that with the other candidates. I like that process. I have to admit, though, it's not as good as, say, being in the parliament and trying to get things over the line, and then getting really excited when you do get policy, your policy platform up. It's different. I wouldn't say I'd like to do it all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many things, that we are also proud of you in, within the vegan and animal rights movement that you've been able to achieve. But I guess, like how do you, I don't even know how to say, I don't want to say what are you most proud of because there'd be so many things, but, tell us some of the things that you've been able to achieve during your time.
Well, I think if we can break it off into some bite-sized chunks, that probably might be easier. If we look at wildlife shelters, rescuers, and carers, so we've been able to achieve over $150 million in funding for those throughout the 4 years. So we're really proud of that. And for some people, it's dependent on their needs, what we've been able to get across the line. And a typical example, there was one shelter that we got $10,000 for, which, in terms of a parliamentary budget, that's nothing. It's a drop in the ocean. But for that particular shelter, that was 7 years worth of funding. So that meant the world to them. Companion animals, for instance, for the whole 4 years, I've been trying to get a new pound and shelter up for Ballarat, which was $0.5 million. And we finally got that done this year. And I was really pleased with that one because it's going to set the benchmark for what council pound will look like for everybody else across the state. In terms, it's been architecturally designed to be state of the art so that when the animals are in there, there's a degree of separation between where they are individually so that they have less anxiety because they're less affected by the animals that are around them. But also because it has a specific section where people who are fleeing a family violence situation can come, walk inside with their animals, be safe inside there because there are secure entrances. They will be in there, they'll be able to be looked after. Those animals will be able to have separate care. No one will know that they're there, and they'll be also able to anonymously leave the shelter without anyone know that they've even come and gone. So they'll be protected, and they'll be able to provide that service to 6 surrounding local government authorities. So it's really important that we protect them in that situation. So I'm really proud of that one. We've achieved a lot in wildlife sector reform. We've got a lot more to go, of course, but we've been able to have huge changes to the Wildlife Act. We've instigated the beginning of what will be Wildlife Rescue Victoria, which is a document that myself and a couple of others spent, a good part of a year writing and then getting the government to agree to it after the bushfires in 2019-20. They saw the need for it to be instigated. Some of the things that are in that can't come to pass until the Wildlife Act is actually reformed and the amendments that need to take place happen in that. But that work's underway now. But also then the review of POCTA, which everybody else has been going through as well, and that's nearly complete. So we convinced the government that it wasn't fit for purpose anymore, and it had to be thrown out and an entirely new act written, which is what we're getting, which will be called the Animal Protection Act. and everybody would have seen and been part of public consultation for that. We've been really pleased with how that's been going. Again, there's still a bit more to go yet, and I need to get back in to make sure the reforms we've got coming in that will happen. And some of those are based around the 17 recommendations I was able to get to the government to agree to in the report that I wrote in the Task Force on Rehoming Pets report. So there's all of that to come in. Some of those things have already happened, like the mandatory reporting. That was one of those recommendations, and we didn't need to write a new act or have that included in the new act per se. It will be there, but it didn't need to happen, now for it to actually be enacted. Some of the reforms we've gotten around animals that are used in medical research, particularly dogs and cats. Look, there's a whole host in that regard. So, as I said, we could rattle on for hours about it. There are so many things. I mean, we had our national conference recently, and I printed out a printout of everything we have actually achieved. And, there were 4.5 pages and 5 minutes to sort of read through them. But there are a couple of things, and I think this is relevant because it's in about keeping with our new slogan, party slogan of animals, people, planet. And if we look in that people section, we can talk about, the funding that I was able to get to establish safer spaces for LGBTIQA plus youth who are at risk of harm, self-harm, and potentially death by suicide. I was put in charge of a task force by the then Health Minister, Martin Foley, because we had a spate of suicides in the Geelong region, and they were largely LGBTIQA plus youth who had come out to family and been rejected and had nowhere to go. So it was really important to establish that. There's a lot more to be done, as I say, in that area. We're on the way to having those open. The first one will be open in Ballarat. Hopefully in the new year. We're looking to be on track for that to happen. The second one in Geelong after that, within a couple of months, and then the last one in the Surf Coast, probably Torquay after that. But, they're only a trial. That's a trial. At the end of the first 12 months, they'll be evaluated and the kinks worked out of it, and then they'll be rolled out across the entire state. But the biggest one I think that we've gotten across the line is something that we've been working on for the whole 4 years. And for a lot of people, they really didn't know it existed until the last few months. And that's Veticare, and which is, universal healthcare, public funded healthcare for animals. And the initial releases on it were about companion animals, dogs and cats or others that they might take to their vet. And we talked about the fact that if you're on a pension or you're a healthcare card holder, you'll be able to bulk bill at your vet, just like you do with Medicare. But there will also be publicly funded vet clinics available for you to go to them, because the initial aspects of it were born about by a crisis in the vet sector that was far-reaching. Vets were and still are at this point leaving the sector in their droves, and it's creating a crisis across the entire state, but indeed across the entire country. And so we sat down and spoke with a number of them to find out what the problems are, what are the stressors in your industry. Some of them were financial, but those financial burdens were caused by the fact that partly because they see wildlife because they have to under the Act, but they've got no one to charge for those services, and it takes time out of their day to actually look after them that they could be having paying clients. They're also not allowed to seek reimbursement from the government for the consumables that they use, like anaesthetics, bandages, or anything like that. So they're out of pocket as well in that regard. So we wanted to alleviate that. So part of that is that we're going to be establishing a whole series of dedicated wildlife hospitals across the entire state, which will be geographically located in strategic locations so that they can service the state best. So those animals will now go to those places and be looked after. So that alleviates that strain. But also we wanted to be able to let vets concentrate on the things that they wanted to concentrate on. So that meant upskilling vet nurses. Now, vet nurses do an extraordinary job, right? Because just like a vet, they study so many different biologies, not just like if you look at a GP, they study the human biology and that's it. That's all they need to know. I'm not saying that that's not difficult, because it is. But if you look at all the different types of animals that a vet has to see, the biologies are remarkably different from one species to the next, to the next, to the next. So there's a lot of extra training. But by comparison, they're paid relatively poorly in comparison to a medical doctor for human terms. So how do we help them concentrate on what they need to concentrate on? Vet nurses do the same type of training across different boards, you know. So we started by convincing the government to have certificate for in vet nursing become a free TAFE course, to put more vet nurses into the system to help alleviate that problem for vets. The next phase of that is to train those vet nurses up to do minor procedures that the vets currently do. So that frees them up again to concentrate on those other ones that they need to do, such as operations, like more major operations and other procedures. And that's on the way. But that also is part and parcel of having to have those changes in the New Animal Protection Act. Those sorts of things have to be written into that. Because they're regulatory, allowing vet nurses to be suitably trained to undertake those procedures. So there's that coming. There's a whole host of things that are wrapped up in that to help vets out. We want to talk to the government about easier pathways for vets who are coming to the country from overseas to have their credentials recognised, so that they can go to work, for instance, in regional areas and have their wages subsidised for a period of years, so that that entices them to stay. You know, they become embedded in their communities, then they've got family there, they're part of their community, and we think that will also help solve that particular problem. So there's those things. There's a whole host of other things that are wrapped up in that we've been working on and adding to it and adding to it and adding to it, to the proposal that we actually put directly to the Premier. And ultimately, that was the pathway to get it across the line. So the motion that we actually passed in the Parliament doesn't look like all of that, but believe me, there's an absolute truckload of changes coming that will take a little bit of time to implement, because nothing's fast. And even after the bill passes next year, and many of these things come into play, there will be others that do take time, because certain other things will need to be phased out for those things to take effect. So.
Yeah, it's really incredible. Like when you first announced that, it's just like unbelievable. It's something that wouldn't have been on anybody's radar. You know, it's incredible to think that we can get that kind of care for animals across the board in Victoria compared to, you know, what we are used to. And I think, had you mentioned, is it a service or like a system that occurs overseas?
No, absolutely not. This is a world first.
Yeah.
There is nowhere on the planet where this is being undertaken. And that's something that the team and I are really proud of, that we were able to knock our heads together and come up with something that is so revolutionary, that if we get it right, and that's why it's also so important to get back into the Parliament, is to make sure that it does get implemented properly, to keep that pressure on the government to make sure that it's done the right way. Because if we get it right, it is the blueprint for every other state, and it's the blueprint for what can happen overseas as well. I mean, there might need to be some adaptations for their different economies or the different cultural aspects, sure, but that's fine. That will be up to them. But the basics of it, I think, will stay the same.
Yeah. And something I think you're regularly asked about is, you know, how do you fund this kind of program? That's something I love. Yeah, tell us about that.
Okay, so one of the things that I've been really proud of is my time in the Parliament. I've been on the board of Vic Health. And again, about that whole thing of serving people, during that time, I've gotten over $3 million in funding for different projects on the This Girl Can program for Western Victoria, because that is my electorate, because I've also been an ambassador for Vic Health for This Girl Can program, which, you know, it encourages and puts things in place and pathways for girls and women of all ages and all capabilities to become involved in sport. You know, to get them that little bit fitter if that's what they want to be, and to have that social cohesion as well that they might be missing. So it's a really fantastic program. Been really proud of that. But Vic Health is funded by the Tobacco Act 1975. And what it does is it takes a certain percentage of the tobacco tax excise to fund it. So I'm not going to point you in the direction of which particular industry has a tax excise attached to it, but the one does in particular. And I have been in discussions with the Treasurer about which particular one and the percentage and what that will provide to be able to pay for this system. And it can certainly pay for it without a problem in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really impressive, because that's always people's first question is how, is it going to come at a cost to us, to taxpayers? So yeah, it's really interesting that there's, some real deep thought put behind that, which is great. And, where are we at with duck shooting? It's always a question that everyone has, Andy.
Well, we are the closest I think that anyone ever has been, without actually getting it over the line. We know that we have the whole of government in terms of the parliamentary wing behind us. It's just now a matter of time, and that's it. But again, we need to be returned, and hopefully, others alongside me, to make sure that the government does follow through and ban duck shooting in Victoria. There's never been a better time. We've shown them time and time again with any number of surveys how many people it would please. So generally speaking, and it varies from place to place in the surveys, but across the board, well over 60% of Victorians want to see it banned. And it's for many of the others, it's just, how do you ban it? Is it an outright ban straight away, or is it a phased out? There's a percentage of that there. I mean, obviously, clearly the bulk of them want it completely gone straight up. And we obviously agree with that. So it's now just, I believe, a question of time. And I've done a lot of work in the background. Again, I've shown the Premier, for instance, I FOI'd where every single registered shooter is in Victoria, where they live. So I was able then to break that down into electorates and show the Premier that the majority of shooters, even though there are only, there's not that many of them anymore, the majority of them are in safe Liberal seats, which the government are never going to win in an election. So they don't need to worry about upsetting those people, right? So that's what we've got coming. We really hope to get that across the line. We've run a number of different campaigns to actually make that happen. We've run a microsite inside the Parliament. So we've cajoled, harassed, done everything we can for each MP to make public their position, and put themselves on that site, so you can look it up with your postcode and see if your MP, Labor MP only, because they're the ones who can ban it, if your local Labor MP is in favour of a ban on duck shooting. And that has had a dramatic effect. It has really pushed it forward. And we've got some real champions within the government too in that regard. It's no secret that Lizzie Blanthorne and Steve McGee have been pushing that barrow for quite some time with us and putting our argument forward within the government. There's no secret about that. That's common knowledge. Indeed, they were the ones that brought a resolution talking about that to the ALP state conference, and got that up. So, we owe them a great debt of gratitude for that. And we are so close. It is just so frustrating that it, through various circumstances this year, it couldn't happen. But, there's a book to be written about it. And I dare say it will be written in a not too distant future.
And, AJP's policies, so they're really encompassing, which everyone can find on the AJP website in case they're not aware of our position on certain things. But I guess, is there anything else that, you really wanted to highlight about what you want to achieve when you're re-elected?
Yeah. Well, obviously, as we've just spoken about, getting duck shooting over the line. I'm keeping my powder dry on a couple of things because I'm actually taking them to the election, and I've had the Parliamentary Budget Office cost them, so that when everyone says, "Oh, that'll cost this, and this," I can say, "Well, actually, no." One of those is greyhound racing. And there are a few others, but as I say, I'll keep my powder dry on those because I'll be taking them to an election platform. There's 5 of them of key policies that I've actually hadn't costed, and the net effect that they'll have on the budget bottom line. So if you don't mind, I won't reveal what they are, but well, jumps racing is one of them. You know, so there you have it. Now the other 3, then I won't tell you.
Fair enough.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry, everyone, but there's got to be an element of surprise when you want to, because you want to spring these things. Politics is often all about the timing.
Exactly. No, exactly right. And so for people that, may, I suppose, be sitting on the fence in regards to, wondering what the difference between AJP and the Greens, for example, what is the difference in the positions, I suppose, of the two parties?
Well, we are, to look to a newcomer who's looking in from the outside, people might think there's not too much difference at all. We do have some pretty solid differences, though, in terms of wildlife, for instance. If we look at kangaroos, we have a policy completely of cutting out kangaroo killing by ATCWs and the harvest management program. We want to see those gone. And we want to see the kangaroo protected in that regard from all of those things. The Greens have a policy that allows for the killing of kangaroos under certain circumstances, and they're quite happy with that, right? They think that they still adhere to this old thing of listening to the farmers when they say they're in so-called plague proportions, when we know that that's not the case. We know that the methodology for counting them is massively flawed, and we know that the so-called damage that they do is just not the case. So, we are vastly different from them in that regard. We also, I believe, have a far better climate policy in that theirs is very much focused on, no coal or gas projects. So the mining aspect of those things, they believe that the fossil fuel industry is a far greater threat to land clearing and those sorts of things than anything else, where that's actually not borne out by any decent evaluation, and certainly not by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They unequivocally state that while that is a factor, it's not the largest. We are, as you well know, one of our key platforms is rationality. So we've examined this quite in depth as a party, and we know that one of the biggest problems is the clearing of land for animal agriculture. It's deforestation for that reason, which does a lot of different things. It inhibits the ability of the planet to actually process carbon dioxide, because that's what trees do. They are the lungs of the world. But it also, in that essence, then creates warming and more severe weather changes. Tree coverage of different types of canopy has evolved over the billions of years of this planet to provide certain habitats underneath that, so understory. And it's different in different places, even within the Victorian state. You go to Gippsland and it's different to how it is in the Otways, and it's different to how it is down on the coastline. We've evolved, these things have evolved for a reason, and they provide different grasses. And when you clear the land for animal agriculture, you remove the capacity of that land to actually have those grasses, to have that understory, because we actually go out and plant grasses that are for grazing purposes. They're not actually native to this country. So we change the landscape again, which adds to that warming, which adds to the more severe weather circumstances. We also then, as a result, remove the capacity of that land to retain moisture naturally. So we have to pump, particularly in the case of dairy, we have to pump that land full of water. You've heard of resting paddocks, in different places, where they'll take dairy cows from one place where they think they've been overgrazing a pasture, and they'll move them to another, and then they'll flood that paddock with water. So it takes an enormous amount of water, not just the amount of water that it takes to have, within the dairy to produce milk. So there's all of that factor. So those things all, they all come into play. And, we've all seen the various documentaries, and, and the jokes have been made about methane and that sort of thing. We've been harping on about that for quite some time. And people think that we've been trying to say that methane from animal agriculture is the biggest contributor. No, we've been saying that animal agriculture as a whole, in what it does in deforestation, in the water use and the land use, is that factor. But methane's part of it. Now, the report came out yesterday that we have to reduce methane in the atmosphere because it's becoming one of the largest factors in and of itself. That's not necessarily part and parcel of the animal agriculture part of it, but it is part of it. But many years ago, some clever scientists worked out that our oceans actually hold a massive methane reserve right at the bottom. So if everyone thinks about it, the deeper down in our oceans you go, the colder it gets, to the point where even right at the bottom in the deepest parts of the oceans, it's at freezing point basically. And there's also a lot of pressure, right, of the weight of that water holding that down. As our atmosphere warms, so do our oceans. The temperature releases that methane. It goes up through the water and breaks the surface. So huge amounts of methane are being released through the warming of our oceans, which again adds to the problem, and it becomes a vicious circle. So that's a different, very different aspect of our policy versus the Greens, right? We have an all-encompassing climate change policy. They have a narrow focus one, right? That's not to say theirs is wrong. I just think it's not as complete as it should be. So they're just two of the probably the most major ones. We don't, I think, have too many disagreements in terms of policy on social justice issues. You know, where there might be slight variances here and there where we think we're better and they might think they're better. But, you know, that's the beauty of how we go about politics, though, and certainly how I've tried to conduct politics in the chamber is we have a collaborative style of politics where we will work with the Greens, we will work with Reason, we will work with any other crossbench party that we think we need to get policy across the line, and with the government in that way as well. Whereas I think it's not, I think, policy per se, but in my observations, the Greens do a demonstrative style of politics. They want to argue and they want to be right. And if it's not perfect, then they might vote it down. That's what I see as what happens. And look, a classic example of that, if anyone doesn't believe me, Kevin Rudd federally was introducing a carbon price. It was a certain percentage, and it was going to be CPI'd and increased over a period of 10 years. The Greens federally wanted it to be far more to start with. So they sided with the Liberal National Party and voted down a carbon price. If they hadn't, we would be in a far better position in this country, not just in terms of climate, but financially, because the net effect of what they were doing was going to contribute significantly to the budget bottom line federally. And we might potentially have been able to come out of the COVID payment scenario that's put us federally into so much debt, along with other factors. I think the Libs have a very poor fiscal management style, and you know they like to state themselves as being the best budget managers, but they're terrible actually. But we might have been able to come out in a really decent position if that had been agreed to. So we don't let the perfect get in the way of the possible, I suppose is the best way to put that.
Yeah. And the Animal Justice Party's experienced so much growth, hasn't it? I mean, I know you're involved right at the start, which we heard in your previous podcast episode on A Kind Life. But, you know, like just even in your 4-year term, you've seen so much growth in the party.
Yeah, I think at our national conference on the weekend, it was said that we've tripled our membership, which is fantastic. And that has a great net effect, because I know that we also have a very strong membership in New South Wales. That's important for a couple of different reasons. They're the two most populous states, so that's really important. But that also gives heart to the other states. And it shows what can be done then by having a large membership base in each state that gets people elected, and then the example is then set of what we're able to get done in the parliament for the other states to be encouraged. Then, you know, they become enthused, they get really excited, and they get more members themselves. This this growth will be exponential across the other states. It will happen. It will be organic, and they will get members elected. As I said before, politics is often all about timing, and that's all it is. And we just have to keep persisting, and that will happen. And we'll have members in Parliament in every other state before the end of the decade, I have no doubt. And others think that might not be fast enough, but you do have to be patient in politics as well. I think we'll get there.
And, for you personally, like, I'm guessing as well, you're just, really proud of everyone's effort to get you to where you are today. And then you're obviously really calling on everyone to help you get re-elected, and other members of Parliament as well for Animal Justice Party.
Oh, look, absolutely. And when I spoke at the national conference on the weekend, I was talking about how, our party is at such an exciting tipping point. This election, we'll have a lower house candidate in every single seat in Victoria, and we'll have the 2 upper house candidates in every region. So we'll have a full deck that we'll be playing with this election. We have never done that before in any state. We have the Conservative press talking about us as the next big force in Australian politics, not just Victorian politics. And so this is something for all the other states to aim for. We've shown the way that this can be done. New South Wales has an election in March. Now, when ours is over and done with, wherever the chips fall, I'm going to make sure I head up there and work with them to help them do exactly the same thing. Let's have them stand candidates in every single seat. And then Queensland is the one after that. South Australia is after that. West Australia is after that. Tasmania is after that. Let's do it. Let's get this done. Let's show everybody that we can do that. And because that gives the electorate as well, through having those numbers, it gives confidence to the electorate that we are a serious political party, that we are responsible, and we can be trusted in those positions. And the example that we set in the Parliament on voting on key social justice issues reinforces that. And I think that then is, as I say, it's such an exciting time for our party, not just now for the state, but nationally. And I honestly believe that we're in a position where we could well walk away with 3 upper house members, hopefully more. There's a lot at play in terms of what effect some of the independents will have on the Conservative vote, because they're not targeting the progressive vote, they're targeting the Conservative seats. And we saw what happened federally in that regard. And I honestly don't think the Victorian Liberal Party have learnt the lesson that was shown in the federal election. And I think that's somewhat sad. Look, everyone knows I'm an avowed lefty, but I'm also a student of politics, and I understand that having a strong opposition is really important. I'm well with several of what we would term the moderate Liberals, the fiscal conservative, but the socially progressive, who have now left. They've abandoned their party in the House. They've resigned because they don't like the direction it's heading in, and they believe that they're headed for a wipeout at the next election. In the lower house, look, there's not going to be too much change, I don't believe. I think the Andrews government will be returned, and comfortably. Whether it's the same margin they have now or more or less, that remains to be seen. But the influence that independents and the Libs and the Greens put together, they won't have enough numbers collectively to make a single iota of difference to how legislation passes in that House, just like this time. The government had such a large majority that collectively all of the opposition and those independents and Greens didn't have the numbers to defeat any legislation or amend any legislation, and the same will be true again. That means power, the true power to be able to make change, lies in the upper house. What happens to the government up there is the question, because in this term of Parliament, they didn't have a majority and they relied on the crossbench. So it's a question of how many numbers they actually end up with this time. The effect of all of those Liberals resigning and the disarray that they're in at the moment, how many people form that crossbench? and the political leaning of that crossbench, whether it's conservative leaning or whether it's progressive leaning. And therein lies the danger, not just for the government, but for the Victorian public. Because if we have an upper house that is ultimately conservative leaning that can vote down any legislation, and we have people from parties that are, somewhat less scrupulous than ourselves, let's say, there's the potential for what is known as blocking supply. And people might not know what that means. Now, blocking supply is not blocking what you might call standard legislation. So let's say it's the Lamingtons in schools bill. They could vote that down. That's not blocking supply, and all other bills of a similar ilk. Blocking supply is when we have the budgetary bills every year come before the Parliament. Now, one of those is a bill that just pays the bills of the Parliament, and continues to let it run. The other one is the one that pays every single public servant, not just them, but our hospitals, our doctors, our nurses, our ambulance, our fireys, our teaching staff. All essential services are wrapped up in that bill. If they block that, that's blocking supply, and the state can't run. It also stops the government of the day from paying its own bills to debt, and even to the interest on debt, which plunges the state into a recession. It's really dangerous, but that's what they could do. And that's, I suppose, the lesson for everybody who might be watching today is there might be people watching who are not necessarily AJP voters. They might not, particularly like us or follow us, but they might watch anyway. They might feel the same way about me. No matter which way you vote, my message is don't vote for a party or an individual that could potentially throw the whole thing into chaos and force us back to another election, because that's what has to happen. Parliament has to be dissolved and we have to go to another election, and elections aren't cheap, and they're disruptive to human discourse. They're disruptive to social cohesion. And I think you also have to think about, we've had 2 elections this year. We're all going to be electioned out, So think carefully about where you're going to spend your vote, Think really carefully, because so much relies upon it.
And, for people, I guess the other thing too that's really important for people to understand is that, you really need support on the ground. So not just for yourself, but for all the candidates across the state. So how can people get involved?
Well, if they go onto the AJP website, they'll be able to find a nice little link where they can go to volunteer. And that's what we need. There's a great saying that is politics is won by those who turn up. And what is meant by that is people who are, during an election, on the booths handing out how to vote cards. That is the single most important thing. We can do all the advertising we want. We can influence people's decisions that way to let them know who we are, what we stand for, and that we can be trusted. But at the end of the day, if they turn up to a booth and there's no one there to give them a how to vote card, then they won't be necessarily sure of what to do next. And there are various ways that people vote. Everyone knows that, we have an upper house and a lower house. So you'll get 2 different ones. You'll have a green slip that will be your lower house, which is the assembly. And it'll have all of those candidates. Now, for people, just a little lesson in how to fill those things out. On the assembly one, you must number all the candidates from 1 down to however many there are in the order of your preference. Now, that goes off, and that's fine. And that's how we form government in the assembly. In the upper house, it's the large white paper. And you have a choice. And this is the argument that people make about this whole preferencing thing, right? People get upset about, and they always post, where are your preferences going? My answer is, where do you want them to go? Because they have that control. They can put a 1 above the line, and yes, certainly that will mean They go where we determine as a party on preference deals that we've arranged with other parties or individuals for that matter. But if they can put 1 to 5 below the line, and then they can send those preferences wherever they want them to go. So if they don't like potentially where, or they're unsure where our preferences might go, they can do that numbering below the line and they can send them where they feel they're best suited. So they have that choice. It's kind of the best of both worlds, I think. You know, it's a hybrid Westminster system that we have in government here and in Parliament, but that is also a hybrid voting system, and I think it gives the best of both worlds. You know, someone who is happy with how we're doing things might just number that one above the line, but someone who thinks, well, no, I actually want to have more control, can do the numbering below the line, and it's perfect. So, you know, that choice is up to them, and I encourage them to do their homework though.
And I was going to say, for people that might not have, been involved in handing out how to vote cards, it is pretty simple, isn't it? In terms of, there is some information provided, and, you can sign up for hopefully, a couple of hours on a number of days. But if you only have election day to spare, that's always, like absolutely better than nothing. It all helps. And I think you were saying, how many polling booths are we expecting this year?
Hundreds in it. Well, I think in one of the electorates that I've got, there's 33 polling booths on election day, just in the one lower house electorate. So that's enormous, right? And when I know other people like who are watching tonight will have voted several times in several elections, most likely, and they'll have seen when they turn up the numbers of people that the Liberal Party have and the Labor Party have to hand out how to vote cards. And they do that for a reason, because most people just want to get in and get out as quickly as possible. So they might rush past the first two, but they'll always pick up something from the third or fourth, and so on and so forth. That's why it is so important. And that we have big numbers at each of the booths. Now, we're sensible about this as well, in that we're not going to go and ask 10 people to go and stand on a booth where there's only 100 people walk through there and that's it, done for the day, and then the rest of the time they're standing around doing nothing. We, like everyone else, have access to the information from the Victorian Electoral the VC, so the Commission, so that we know the numbers of people traditionally, like each election, have gone through individual booths. So we look at that, and they're the priority, to make sure that we've got people, the most numbers of people in those places. That's just smart. So we don't ask anyone to go and stand on a booth all day on their own or anything like that. There's always relief. And it's a great experience too, Most of the time on booths, there's a bit of camaraderie. Yes, I think there's a little bit of gentle digging and a bit of joking either way, but that's all part of the fun. Generally speaking, most people are pretty collegiate, because everyone understands they're there for the same reason, right? And that it's the pointy end of the stick.
Yeah.
So, I encourage everyone who, if you haven't done it before, please sign up. We all need the help, and you can, we'll be greatly appreciative, because that's part of like half of that puzzle of having all of those candidates. The other half of the puzzle is having people to support them at the booths and get the result that we want. Because we also know from the VC's numbers, because they've done the research, it's there for anyone to see, is that when you have someone handing out a how to vote card on a booth, your voting numbers increase by 30%. And that might sound really, really outrageous claim, but it's actually true.
Yeah. Which is, it's a huge statistic when you think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. And that could well be the whole and sole reason difference between say me being re-elected or not, but also between having other people come and join me in the upper house or not. Yeah. That might just be the difference. And I don't want people to be regretting not doing it if at the end of the election we're it's all over, and they sit there and go, well, geez, maybe if I'd done that, maybe they'd be there. I don't want them to regret that. So I think do it. Just sign up an hour, 2 hours, a couple of days a week, because that's the other thing. There is pre-poll, right? Pre-poll booths. That's really important to mention the difference between the two on election day and pre-poll. I've been on the Electoral Matters Committee in the Parliament. We met with the VC regularly, and they estimate that there'll be well in excess of 60% of voters go through in the pre-poll 2 weeks. Right. The good thing about that is, of course, is there are less pre-poll booths. So, you know, and the heavy times will be those Thursday, Fridays, and that one Saturday. So they'll be the heavy times, and they will need people most in that regard. That's still over 30%, though, that will go through on election day, all in one day. So that's a lot of people in movement on one day. So we need people for both.
I think you've said before that there at the last election, there was a seat that was won by like a ridiculously small amount of votes. Was it? I think it was like 15, or it was a very small
That's
number,
correct.
wasn't it?
That's correct. It's the most marginal seat in Australia. It's a state political seat, but it's the most marginal seat in Australia. And that's the seat of Ripon in my electorate. And it was literally won by 15 votes by Louise Staley of the Liberal Party after 5 counts. Wow. That's what it got down to. Every time they counted, it got down less and less. So, you know, we have the power, and this is it's an incredible thing to be having in a situation at an election. We have the power as a minor party to change that seat. That gives us the leverage that we're looking for with the incumbent government to be able to say, well, we can turn that seat for you, right? So we're looking for suitable preferences. We're looking for you to help us with our policy when we get in, right? So, you know, it's not a horse trading exercise by any stretch of the imagination. It's each political party facing the realities of what is there on the table. But there are others too where we can have that sort of influence. Again, in my electorate, the seat of poll was, you know, it was 133 years in Liberal hands. You know, and due to boundary changes, the margin in that seat is now down to 2.1%, which now also includes a really progressive voting bloc, which, if they vote the way they've traditionally done, will change the seat, and there's nothing that the Libs can do about it. And again, though, the argument that I keep making to the government is, well, you know, have a good look at us because we're the ones that can help you change that seat. So again, come to the party. And this is reflected in seats across the board, by the way. There's lots of marginal seats, so-called marginal seats, where we can influence what happens. You know, we can't get enough votes on our own, even with preference deals, to get anyone up in the lower house. So that's why our concentration is the upper house. That's where we can wield that power that we need to wield, pull the levers that we need to pull to get things across the line for animals.
Yeah. And, you know, if you, I suppose now 4 years on, you could say a bit of wisdom you've had over time. What's, you know, something that I guess you would now tell yourself if you were starting again? Like, what have you learned in that time?
Oh, great question. Look, we came in, so I had a good knowledge of the parliament and the parliamentary system and how it works. I had a relationship already built with lots of Labor figures, and I knew personally also some of the Liberal figures. What I guess I didn't understand at the time is the interpersonal relationships that exist between the Labor government and some of the other minor parties. You know, because I was so focused on building those relationships myself that it probably didn't really occur to me as much that they would be doing the same thing. All right. I don't think they've done it to the same degree that we have. But I think they have still done it, and that has had an influence. And I think now going into a second term, understanding that and the byplay that creates, but also not really going in, we didn't really understand the power of the committee process, you know, the parliamentary committees and what you can achieve in that. I'd watched Fiona Patten use it really, really well, but I didn't give it enough focus. I think that we could use that for animal issues. I thought that would really just be for social justice issues. So now going in, particularly, I think we can make a real strategic choice. If we get 3 members elected, for instance, because in the upper house you only get 2 chances per year to lead debate, and have something voted on. If we have 3 people elected, that's 6 chances per year, right? So we can utilise one of our members to put forward committee references for things that we want to get up, to have inquiries, parliamentary inquiries. And that still leaves us with 4 spots to be able to get motions up that we can get the government to vote on and try and get them to vote in favour of that. So that's an enormous number of changes that we can make, right? But it's also 3 officers with staff working on amendments to other acts that are coming through to make changes that we want. So there's an enormous coverage that we can get across the board. That's the change, I think, that we can make coming into a new parliament that we didn't quite understand when we first came in, that we do now. That's, I suppose, one of the big lessons that we've learned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, so we were at their candidate launch yesterday, and you did provide like an incredible speech, which we were trying to give you a standing ovation, but you didn't like that idea. You told us to not clap and sit down. But I really, it is definitely testament to the incredible support you have with all of us. And you do have this amazing ability to really get people, on board and get them to understand the importance of having, Animal Justice Party members in Parliament. So to close us out, I guess, Andy, is there anything that, you really just want to highlight and, bring to the attention of people listening to the podcast that could help in the upcoming election?
Please just help us out. Please volunteer to help hand out how to vote cards. I think that we've shown, and my team and I have shown, that we are the best bet that all animals have for getting things done. We wholly and solely are. We've shown it time and time and time again in the parliament. And if you think that we've done well, just stop and have a think for a moment about how much more we can get done with more members. And the only way we can get more members is to have those boots on the ground. We need people. That's what we need on those booths. And that's, I suppose, the plea that I put out there for anyone listening. Get in touch, get involved. If you think after that process you like what you've seen, you like what's been achieved, join, become a member of the party, because that is also a wonderful thing to be able to do, to get involved with the committees and the branches, and be involved in that process and influence the change in policy, And I want to see more women involved. I know we're a great party for having women involved. I think we've got more women running and involved in the offices in the party than any other in the country, really. And I think that's really super important. But I guess I really want to see also, different. Victoria is a microcosm of Australia in that we're a multicultural society. I want to see more people from different cultural backgrounds in the party, in offices and also in the parliament. I want to see them running. I want to see young people, I want to see them take the anger that they have had over the climate rallies and turn that into political clout by being part of our party and getting elected to parliament and making that change. I want to look out over that chamber and see a vastly different change to what it was when I walked in there and what I've been watching for the past nearly 30 years.
Yeah. Well, your passion and excitement, Andy, is very contagious. And I know everyone that has the opportunity to meet you in person or, see you at different events is so grateful to not only have you there, but also to just know that like you said, it's really, the momentum is building and this is really just the start, and we've got the opportunity to make such a difference. So thank you again. And we're so lucky to have you.
An absolute pleasure as always, Alicia. Thank you so much.
Take care, Andy. Thank you.